Hey there, welcome back to Brad's Labs. So today we're going to be doing something a little bit different. We don't have a artifact that we can actually handle or show. I've got a thing I've collected and some things I've 3D printed. But with it being that time of the year again, spooky scary month is upon us, I am not above cashing in on any of that. So today we're actually going to be looking at vampires and the lure behind them. And next week we're actually going to be looking at vampire burials and how people tried to deal with vampires. So please, if you like the video, give us a like, give us a share, subscribe. You don't have to do any of that if you don't want to, but it would help us. So thank you. So we're going to start off by looking at the origins of vampires, but not as we would know them today. The idea of a vampire started off as a more ghostly, incorporeal idea. They weren't the figure stalking you in the middle of the night to drink your blood. They started off in Slavic culture, and they were called Upior. But the idea of a Upior, like I said, it was more of a ghostly idea, spirit. And it was somebody that died of causes that we'll get into in a minute, because there was many different ways to become a vampire. But the person would die and then come back and drain the life force from another individual. And the whole idea of the UPR started because we didn't really know much about germ theory or viruses or anything like that. So, somebody in this house had a virus, they died, they were buried, but then next night, a couple nights later, somebody else in that same house would die. Well, the idea was that the UPR came back to claim victims and drain the life force from the individuals in that house. But when that house was exhausted, individual over here would start to die, or many people around the area would start to die. And it was just a way that they dealt with the unknown. So for them, the idea of the UPR, it entered the house, it didn't need to have permission. It could just enter. But the way it entered through the house wasn't, opening a door or anything like that. It was any crack or opening into the house that they could get through. So let's say you had a hole in the wall, or you left your window open, or there was a keyhole. If you didn't stuff, close, or fill any of those holes, then the UPR would be able to get into your house and would be able to drain the life force and move on to its next victim. So as time went on, we started to see the idea of vampires appearing in other cultures around Europe, but they started to take on personifications of the cultures that they were introduced into. And that's one thing that we as humans constantly do is we take something from another culture and we repurpose it to make sense in our own culture. But from that, we actually start to get some of the ideas that we see in modern vampires to this day. The idea of a vampire transforming into an animal of some sort actually came from the Walieka, and they were a group of people in Romania, but they would transform into bears or uh, wolves, something that would kill you. But we also start to see the idea that a vampire can only be up during certain hours. But unlike in modern culture where it can only be up at night, in Poland and in Russia, the idea that was the vampire would come up during noon and it would have to be back into its grave by midnight.
So it's 6 p.m. in the nighttime, which is when I wake up. This is always a really scary part for me. Yes! Nighttime.
So we start to see this more common idea forming of what we would know vampires as today. But in English, the word vampire actually doesn't appear until 1732. And we got the word vampire from the German and the French. But it also appears in other spellings. Vampire is another way we've seen it spelled. But we start to see this more modern idea of vampires appearing because, like I said, what works for one culture may not work for another, but we will still take from it, morph it into what works for our culture, and voila, you've got a whole new monster that is radically different from this monster, but they're still the same concept. So now let's talk about how you would become a vampire. And as I've mentioned, the idea of a vampire transitioned from culture to culture, time period to time period. But early on, the idea of becoming a vampire was due to unclean death. The idea of an unclean death was, if you're walking down the street and you just drop dead, that's an unclean death. If you take your own life, unclean. If you are executed for crimes, that's an unclean death. So basically, to say any kind of death that wasn't from old age. And even sometimes those would be considered unclean deaths because, let's say that there was somebody in the community that didn't like you. All they had to do was sit there and say you were a vampire, and all of a sudden your corpse is being defiled. But we'll get into that more next week. But other ways that you could, become a vampire was if the parents cursed the child. And that sounds weird, but that's just a way to say that the parents had the child out of wedlock. All of a sudden, this child is cursed, and that curse is carried through with it its whole life. So even if it has a clean death, it's an unclean death, and they become a vampire. So there was many different ways that unclean deaths would occur, and it was just their way of dealing with the stresses of everyday life. I say that a lot, but that's what we as humans do. We give reason to things that may not necessarily have reason because we want to feel secure about the idea. But there were some more ideas behind how to become a vampire that we as modern society would look at them and go, why did anybody ever think that? And some of the ideas were, let's say, an animal, mainly a cat, jumping over the corpse before it was buried. Well, that would make that corpse all of a sudden a vampire. If there were birds that flew over the corpse, you would have yourself a vampire. And I live in an area where there are birds flying constantly, so I'm going to assume that a lot of people here are vampires. But ideas like that, they came about, yet again, to help us cope with our understanding of the world around us. So now that I've given you a very brief overview of what vampires are, and do go out, look up more of the origins of vampires, there's plenty of research, and it's amazing to see how we as a species developed concepts and ideas to deal with the world around us. But if that's something that interests you, please go out and look it up. But let's get into a more modern idea of a vampire. And we start to see this idea of a vampire forming to what we know in things like Bram Stoker's Dracula. And Bram Stoker's Dracula was possibly a composite between two different people. You had Vlad the Impaler and Countess Bathory. And I'm not going to go too much into depth on them because there's other videos that have talked about them. But we start to see this idea of a vampire, morphing into an animal, and that is something that was brought from way back when. Sucking the blood, seducing, doing things that were deemed impure by the standards of that day. And a lot of those ideas still carried on through all the way to today, where we've started to change it again for the culture that we do live in. And the idea of like Buffy the Vampire Slayer. You have the undead that gets up, walks during the night, but when you stake the vampire, they turn into dust. And that is a more modern concept. The Twilight. I don't honestly know much about Twilight. That was well past my time period. But that is, yet again, just another evolution of what we think of vampires as to today. And I'm almost 100% certain that, 20, 30, 100 years from now, the idea of a vampire will have evolved yet again to help cope with the times that we're living in then. So I hope you did learn something from this video today. If you did learn something, please give it a like, a share, subscribe, all those fun little bells and whistles that will pop up all around me right now. But I wanted to take and give you an update on what we're going to be doing during this month because, I'm going all in on Halloween. So next week we're actually going to be looking at the burials and how to kill, so to say, a vampire. And then the following week after that, we're going to be looking at ritualistic deposits. Um, Trust me, it's got some weird, spooky vibes to it. After that, it's up in the air. Not really. We know what we're doing, but you're gonna have to wait to find out because how else are we gonna keep you hooked and keep you coming back for more? But yeah, if you did like the video, you know, give it a like, share, subscribe. We're trying to get to just 100 subscribers so I can get a drone. Megan hasn't specified what kind of drone it's gonna be, but I would really, really like a drone. And she set the bar extremely low on that one. So if we can get to 100, you'll get a video of me flying that drone and probably crashing it multiple times. But please, I want my drone. I really want my drone. But other than that, I'd like to thank the patrons. We are doing a thing for the patrons where everything on our store, they do get a discount for purchases. So if you'd like a discount on our store, feel free to sign up, become a patron. If not, you can feel free to buy our stuff as it is anyway. Other than that, yeah, thank you for showing up and letting me talk to you for however long this video is. So yeah, hope you have a good day.